Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Chang Change, and our second edition of Supply Chain Academics. While every other week will feature me as a host interviewing special guests, these episodes feature our academic hosts applying their expert opinions on a variety of topics every 2 weeks. Right, let's get into the episode by meeting our academic hosts.
Right. Good day, my name is Liam, Associate Professor of Supply Chain at the University of Northampton.
Hello, I'm Mills and I'm Associate Professor of Risk and Security, also at the University of Northampton. And our first topic of today is the sick cow meat scandal, yet another example of supply chain causing a few problems to food suppliers, producers, consumers and those concerned about their diets in Europe. So a quick summary, Liam, what's been going on?
I don't think I can do a quick summary. I'll try and do a quick summary. We saw we've got a horse meat scandal back in 4 years ago now. We all saw that hit the nail, and then lots of people had said, including myself, that we will have another one. It's surprising it's taken this long to happen.
Yep.
And it has. So in Poland, an abattoir part of the supply chain has been found taking sick cows and pulling them against their will into, I must put it there that no cow goes in, or its will.
Cows don't have will. What are you talking about?
To think that they've been taking sick animals into the food chain, and there's obviously a risk to human health with this because these animals are deemed as not fit for human consumption.
Yep.
There's clearly a lot of research needs to be done to clear that up. However, the interesting thing I find, and hopefully others will, is this wasn't found due to some amazing web crawling AI piece of technology. There were no chains of block involved with this.
No.
There were no what do you call those people? Interpol, collusion, intel stuff going on. This was a worker who found that ethically this is quite crap, and actually I'm going to video this and release it to the world. What do you think, Mills?
Yes, well, I think also this does bring into sharp focus the issue of activists helping protect us from problems in particularly the food supply chain. And often these are not kind of benign actors. So yes, indeed, this could well be a worker who had some ethical issues with this appalling practice going on with downed stock and so on. But of course, what should really have happened is there should have been a process to whistleblow so that as few animals as possible got into the supply chain. Absolutely. As opposed to capturing loads and loads of footage which will drive clicks to various activist websites and drive donations. And certainly in the UK, or in England rather, there's been a number of court cases where judges have strongly criticised undercover filming in such facilities because the earliest opportunity to report it to the police and the Food Standards Agency and others has been missed because the organisation's key purpose was collecting a load of graphic, unpleasant footage. So I think that's a bit of an issue. I mean, it's good that we know about this, and it's good that as far as we know, the EU's rapid alert system for food and feed was triggered, and so recalls and consumer alerts can go out. But it does uncover the fact that really we shouldn't rely on activist groups. They're going to wait a long time before releasing footage to the public / authorities. And actually the supply chain could and should have found out this stuff on its own. Yeah,
that's a really good point, because actually as the investigative TV programme the Polish investigative TV programme has highlighted, it took 3 weeks before this footage came out. The speed at which supply chains, I wouldn't even want to guess how many animals had now been put through the supply chain, but it'd be potentially thousands, and this is so far down the chain, into the food chains. The potential to recall now is pretty much gone. It's pointless doing any product recalls because it will be in the system. So I think you make a incredibly valid point, and maybe there's something around risk mitigation protocols and the alerting. Are people in these supply chains aware that there is a duty of care to blow the whistle, and are they aware of those processes?
Sure, and as an anthropologist, my key thought would be, what little contact I've had with abattoirs and the livestock industry has been that quite often there isn't much of an organisational culture of caring about the world outside the four walls of the plant. And actually, with the sort of cost pressures on abattoirs and throughput and so on, it's a very challenging environment to introduce the duty to report and so on to individuals who work in those places who, they don't need to have massive amounts of education. Should we be relying on them to be the whistleblowers? Possibly not. is the solution CCTV in every single abattoir that someone remotely is monitoring? I mean, I can never quite understand why people think CCTV is the solution, just because concealed CCTV is found the problem in the first place.
Well, actually, there was a really good case last year exposed, and it didn't actually happen last year, of the Kellogg's plant.
Oh yes, right, okay.
Chap urinating on the cornflakes,
right,
in clear view of CCTV, but it took weeks for it to come out. So it's pretty. Yeah, you can have CCTV, but you've got to have someone looking at it 24/7 in order to be able to.
Yeah, absolutely. And those of us who had our cars broken into in train rail stations and all protected by CCTV, and then you discover it wasn't switched on, the camera was broken. How long was it broken for? Oh, 3 months.
Yeah,
etc. etc. So it isn't a silver bullet, is it?
And there's also another piece as well. It's slightly going off topic, but it is related. Take this away from this particular example of the slaughterhouse and take it to a supply chain view.
Yeah.
A high proportion of people working in the supply chain are on 0 hours contracts, or they're agency workers.
Yeah.
Therefore, they come into an organisation and do the shift supervisors brief them on all the company policies and procedures around things like this? The answer, quite frankly, is no.
Yeah,
so there's
sure.
Potentially 30% of your workforce don't even understand the ethical considerations and what you do if you see something happening in the supply chain.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's one of the most dangerous industrial jobs to have, isn't it? Certainly in America, the level of, first of all, undocumented employees, but also those who end up with terrible injuries quite often from animal handling or using some of these big saws and such like, very, very high. So it's I don't know, it's a very challenging environment to kind of fix, but it does just kind of sum up, risk management is in the supply chain is a tough thing, and in particular, the culture here is such that management seem to have indicated that workers should remove evidence from the carcasses that the animals had been down as stock, so pressure sores and tumours and such like. Now, I would have thought, the EU-wide veterinary inspection of carcasses should kick in at some point, where they would see those removal of various parts of the sides of beef and so on. But it looks as though veterinary inspection was bypassed somehow or other. This stuff was done at night. How it got around those inspections, maybe there was some falsification of paperwork. So it's not as though it couldn't have been other red flags that could have been spotted. So yet again, another story where there's more to it than just the rather gruesome front end, I think.
I think just to put some context around that and try and, I don't want to try and defend the system, but just to give the complexity of the system. Just in the UK last year, there was 8 billion animals slaughtered for human consumption. Yeah. Having somebody to check 8 billion carcasses is, frankly, it's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess most of those are chickens, probably.
But my point is, we're still reliant. We're not beholden to one system. We're beholden to a system of systems, if that exists.
Yes.
That are quite frankly not connected. And if the systems were connected, so you've got intelligence systems across Europe that aren't connected. There's police forces in the UK that aren't connected. They're not talking to farmers. Farmers don't know who to talk to whistleblow. The whole system, if it was gelled together through some sort of tool or AI or connection system, then surely it would be better, and we can pull together all these different risks. Whereas at the minute, each piece of risk is looked at in isolation.
Yeah, that's true. I suppose the other takeaway message, no pun intended, talking about food and chicken in particular, the other takeaway message is that food does remain incredibly safe, and a lot of the concerns, evidence through recalls and so on, are probably not about meat which is going to do us any damage, but meat which just shouldn't be going in the food chain. Very unwise for it to be put in, but having said that, no one's actually dying from consuming this stuff.
No, you're correct, and this comes exactly back to what came out of the Horsegate scandal a few years ago. It wasn't actually that the meat was horse meat, because there's nothing wrong with horse meat. It was the fact that you were buying premium cuts of beef and actually you weren't. It was about consumer trust, and I suppose this is for another day, but you've got to ask yourself, at least I got to ask myself, why are these people driven to do this? And quite frankly, it's because of squeezed margins in food supply chains. There's only one reason people don't get up in the morning and decide they're going to do bad things. There's a reason why this is happening. It's because margins are being squeezed. the volume of product that they need to turn out is getting higher.
Yeah.
And they are, I'm not condoning it, but they're resorting to tactics just to keep the plant moving and to keep the plant in profit.
Yeah, sure, and obviously disposing of downer cattle, not putting them into the food chain is a cost, because that's then waste.
Yeah.
So it's a way of reducing your waste costs, isn't it? Okay, so all a bit grim, but we're kind of suggesting we don't need to panic too much about it, and certainly supply chains in the UK involving red meat and so on are pretty well scrutinised, and obviously room for improvement, and lots of campaigns to reintroduce regional abattoirs and so on to reduce the amount of time that stock are travelling, and maybe reconnect consumers with the necessary role of slaughterhouses and abattoirs, which they probably don't want to face up to, but it's probably easy getting your head around when it's one butcher killing 4 or 5 head of cattle a day rather than the plant processing 300 or 400. And
I'm feeling hungry, so it doesn't put me off food.
You're always hungry.
To abate my hunger, I think we need to move on to the next topic so we can finish quickly. So, intellectual property theft. Mills.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in intellectual property theft, not least when it intersects with cyber and the use of human ingenuity to get around security systems and such like. So the story that I picked up on Bloomberg was about an inventor who'd worked out an entirely new way of coating glass with a very thin layer of diamonds to make it mega tough, tougher than existing glass used, for example, in iPhones and other smartphones. And having invented this after many, many years of research in universities and elsewhere, he then and his team provided samples of this amazing product to smartphone manufacturers, hoping that one or more of them would bite and make contracts with him to produce large quantities of this.
Research conflict mineral free?
Yeah, because that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, one would hope so, but as is so often the case, maybe those issues of ethics hadn't been covered off. We'll have to follow up with that after the podcast and put that in the programme notes. Thanks for that, Liam. So all of these smartphone manufacturers who received samples of this glass signed all sorts of very tight contracts to commit, to example, not to destructively test his material, but rather to see whether it stood up to a sort of usage that a mobile phone normally gets, i.e. chucked in a pocket, jangled around with keys, dropped from such and such a height, and so on and so forth, but not actually taking it to pieces to try and reverse engineer it. And one of the companies that he dealt with, we'll not be referring to brands here if we can avoid it, is a Chinese state-owned smartphone manufacturer who also signed all these documents. But to cut a very long story short, the glass came back broken, which in itself is quite an achievement. The FBI were alerted by the inventor and his team as to what had happened, i.e. the glass had come back late, the glass was broken, and the glass had gone back to China, which it shouldn't have done because there's a potential for dual use of this coating in defence, or rather offence, technologies. And the FBI then worked with the inventor to do some covert recording of his discussions with his Chinese smartphone producers, personnel in California. And we wait to see what's going to happen, but there are going to be grand jury indictments, and it's a case that's going to run and run. But the FBI, we now learn, has at least one person who is a forensic gemologist, which is an awesome niche skill set. And he concluded that some incredibly powerful laser had been fired at this piece of glass in order to break it apart so that more could be learnt about how it was constituted. So, to try and summarise all of that, obviously those of us who like to think we can come up with great ideas and products and services are always at risk of being ripped off and scammed, either by competitors of a local variety or nation states. And if you want a quick update on the things we should be worried about, then I could point you to the Lithuanian government's national security assessment, which came out this week, and it describes all of the ways in which Russia and China and other countries are doing all sorts of things across Europe, targeting Lithuanians and others in country and particularly outside, in order to get information from them relating to economic advantage and other things. And it's all a little bit worrying. I guess theft of ideas has been around for a long time, Liam. You've got a strong background in supply chain security with some global brands. I kind of think, wow, this is a new and exciting thing. But in our pre-podcast conversation, you were saying this isn't new at all.
No, and actually, I just want to point out, I'm really, really excited that the FBI are getting involved in logistics and doing something about reducing the billions of pounds worth of damaged goods. They could have been around for Christmas with all the stuff that came through my door that was kicked and scratched. But
fair point.
There's been a thing around in supply chains and engineering for a long time called reverse engineering. And it's classic cases of this with, I'm going to fall on the sword here because I can't remember exactly what the designator was, but we all remember the fabulous jet that is Concorde that got... The Russians then released one very closely behind it.
Konkordsky, wasn't it?
Something like that, with little winglets up by the nose and look the same. There have been things that have come out of manufacturing plants in Asia that look remarkably like a BMW X5. I know we wouldn't mention brands, but I just have. But
looks like it's fine, I think.
Yeah, it looks like one, and so on and so forth. And having worked for a large tech company, I've seen this firsthand where stuff would go missing en route, especially through the R&D factories around glass and chips and bits and pieces, and it would be quite well known in those supply chain areas that things are being traded between companies and reverse engineers.
Right, so an open secret in a way.
Pretty much, and you how do you protect something like that? I mean, we've had instances where items like that have been bag carried.
Well, I was going to say,
on flights, to ensure that
I'd imagine sort of a Hollywood type thing of a briefcase handcuffed to a person that's never out of that person's sight and so on.
But and you can do it through. I mean, the classic thing is that when we were sending small items through air freight, we'd always put a third of what we needed on board because it would go missing. So even the protected supply chains are not protected. But the hand carrying stuff only works up to a point because you have to get into an area where you need to start mass manufacturing this to see if it will work. It's great having an idea, but you've got to design the manufacturing processes, which mean you have to hand that trusted bit of kit over to an engineering company, and you're relying on them to look after your bit of kit. And all the while it's in this engineering company, it could be taken, deconstructed. So this isn't really a surprise, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe the bigger surprise is how the fingerprints of particularly the Chinese government at the moment are so openly on a lot of these breaches of trust and contract relating to intellectual property, let alone the actual out-and-out theft of stuff. It's almost as though either they don't care if they're caught anymore, or maybe the Chinese have made, the nation leadership have made some kind of strategic error and actually thought that they could keep doing this for a long time. And actually, maybe we, dare I say it, maybe this is an upside of the Trump administration, is actually we're now in a point where businesses, inventors, the FBI, regulators and others won't put up with Chinese state interference in telecoms, in internet backbone infrastructures and so on.
I don't necessarily think it's only the Chinese doing this. I think there are many other actors, including the country that we're sat in, that are up to this sort of stuff. And I think there's a commercial consideration behind each one of these wrongs that go on within business and within governments, and each country has its own GDP and its own agenda.
Yeah.
And I'll be careful what I say because I don't want to mention names. But there are things happening in Europe that are exactly the same as this in terms of IP theft on significant IP theft.
But maybe not with the fingerprints of the commissioning government quite so obvious.
It doesn't necessarily be obvious. Doesn't mean to say it's not happening.
True enough. Yes, good point.
There are many consultancy agencies that look on the outside like they're private organisations, but they've been born from government organisations that are doing similar stuff.
Yeah,
crawling around looking for the next invention, intercepting products as they move through the supply chain. It's I don't think there's an answer to it. I personally don't. I'm not surprised by it, so I don't see a major risk with it because it's, as we discussed before the podcast. The IP of something is only as good. It's only good until you manufacture the product, and once the product's out there, you can re-engineer the product and make it look slightly like the other one, a bit like the Konkordsky piece.
Yeah.
I suppose with this, the key thing is the trust somebody signed a document saying they won't do this, and then they have done this.
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
issue here.
Yeah,
not the actual act of doing it. It's the fact you said you wouldn't do it and you've done it.
And we're so easily caught doing it. Returning something almost indestructible in a destroyed state.
That's big belief why you would do that. Because if you were going to do it, you wouldn't want anyone to know you've done it.
Sure.
Unless it is a strategy to let people know you have done it, which I can't think why you would want to do that.
Yeah. Anyway, you make a very good point that all nation states are all scrabbling to get competitive advantage over one another, and they sometimes do things which are sailing close to the wind in terms of legality, or in fact going well over the line of legality. And maybe we should, as an anthropologist, I should endorse this, take a culturally relative point of view and say that actually, if we're doing this thing, then we shouldn't be too surprised if other nations are, if they're doing it really openly and they can live with the consequences. Maybe that's just changing how stuff like this is going to be done in the future. Who knows?
And there is a little bit as well, being pragmatic about it. We've done this by design. So I say we as a global community, very strong word, exploited. We've exploited the lower labour costs of other regions of the world, and we've pumped money into developing manufacturing facilities and R&D facilities in those regions because labour is cheaper. And now we're surprised because these regions hold the global power play in technology.
Except they don't, because they're having to steal it from little inventors in California.
But they're still the ones that are going to manufacture this, because the manufacturing processes cannot take place in. I had a recent trip out to Taiwan, and even their manufacturing now is minimalised. They're doing the R&D in Taiwan and the manufacturing in China. We're beholden on the system, and there's another topic but related, all the raw materials that go into these things, these products that we use and all over our desk in front of us here now, is controlled by that region of the world. So if you want to make something that has a diamond glass on it, or it has cobalt or something like that in it, you've got to say, well, who owns the raw material? Who has that stock of raw material? Well, it's not the Americans, it's not Europe, it's not Africa.
No, they might have it in their ground,
but
they don't own it.
Yeah. So we've built this system, we force these people into manufacturing, we've given them the tools to become the global power plays. Yes, well, you're right, they're not designing it, but where else are you going to get it manufactured? Classic example with aforementioned company that I used to work for that does all its R&D, or the majority of its R&D in America, looked at, when I was there, they had a similar thing. Actually, it was with glass. It was a new type of glass they were putting into the product.
Yeah.
Be careful with that. And they looked to manufacture that in the US to try and mitigate the risk of it being copied and reverse engineered.
Yeah.
They could not make it work in terms of cost.
Right.
The product, when it came to shelves, would be out of reach to everyone because of the cost involved. Yeah. So they had to go back to manufacturing it in Asia. And guess what?
Risks attendant,
It got copied, and that other brand very shortly after released exactly the same thing. So it's a quite radical view, but we've created this. I'm not said right.
But it's just how the world is now working. Yeah, right. And you can try and enforce things through law afterwards, but that's always going to be behind the curve of people making money from.
Maybe it's a cost of doing business. Maybe with a smartphone, do you know what? It doesn't really matter if it gets copied. It's easy for me to say I'm not the inventor, I'm not losing millions, but it doesn't really matter. But if you are building a military piece of hardware that's the capability to, if it gets into the wrong hands, be massively disruptive, maybe at that point you need to take decisions and say, you know what, it's going to cost us more to build it, but the right thing to do is to make sure we build it in our own borders, in our own lands, to protect it. So maybe perhaps there's a piece where decisions need to be made not on cost, but on
to use the S word, which I'm sure you don't like, that there could be a government subsidy to encourage or make sure that happens in the interest of strategic national security, but it does require dipping into taxpayer funds in order to assure that stuff's not going to be reverse engineered elsewhere and misused, and then come back and haunt us with a transfer of technology to a terrorist group. Or
better to invest a subsidy of $500 million than spend $3 billion retrospectively trying to build security measures or fix problems. So it's actually, if you take a longer term view, it's an investment worthy.
Couldn't agree more. Now, in terms of something else for which we all need a longer term view, and I think you and I are probably going to violently.
I'm still
agree.
hungry, by the way.
No, we'll try and get through this. I can hear your stomach growling.
It's not just my anger at the topic.
a very long-term view. You and I are probably going to agree violently that these things are never going to happen, and then we might get proved wrong.
2050.
But 2050, yeah, okay. Autonomous vehicles, topic 3. So the Nissan Renault Mitsubishi Alliance, some awesome cars produced by them and some less awesome ones,
are they made up north? Oh no, we're not. We said we wouldn't mention the
into the swear jar for any mentions of BREXIT, or anything related to it. Yes,
there's a place in hell for you for mentioning that now.
You're gone. You're going to burn forever. Anyway, so this alliance are going to work with Waymo, part of Google, to launch potentially self-driving taxis in Europe. So our wonderful producer Charlie has given us some interesting questions to kick off the discussion. It's going to be tricky to hold us back on all this thing.
Can I just say no to all of them?
Probably. Are autonomous vehicles the future? A question that's been asked since about 1930, probably.
No.
Why not? Everyone's talking about them. Everyone wants. Well, not everyone wants one, but a lot of people seem to want them.
Bloody well don't. It's so sick and tired of it. I think semi-autonomy is great. Autonomous vehicles, we're ploughing loads of money into this thing, and we can't even use the existing network that resides. And we're going to go down, and we think that having autonomous vehicles with the fix, you think it's going to get elderly people out and about. You think it's going to reduce congestion. It's not. Not at all. There's nothing about it, because we won't, as human beings, share. We still want our own vehicles. So autonomous vehicles can only be the future if our culture, as it stands now, radically changes to a sharing economy.
Which is a really big ask, and I'm not sure that's ever happened in the history of humanity. So if we could come up with a way of doing that, we'd be very wealthy. But even I'm quite an ambitious person. I know you're even more ambitious, but I would be reluctant to say I could achieve that.
And actually, the topic, staying actually on the topic rather than getting on my pet soapbox, why do we want autonomous taxis? That's a single-use vehicle that's going to take one person to a point, drop them off, and then be empty coming back. So unless you're going to build this and weave this into a public transport network where you can only go from point A to B when somebody in point B has a return load, so it's full going out and full going back, what we're going to do is create more vehicles on the road. There's a well-known brand that gets a lot of bashing in the press that evidently in London has caused an increase in single-use journeys because of the disruptive technology. That I suppose there's a point around that disruptive technology is easier to use than an underground train, because I can just book this thing on an app and it will tell me when it's outside. So actually the ethical considerations of me putting more cars on the road don't really matter, because I'm getting to A to B quicker.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of ethical, cultural considerations with this that I think frankly aren't being recognised.
So why on earth are such big brands even thinking about taxis? Why are we doing this? I mean, they're clearly going to be pumping quite a lot of money into this.
Because there's a...
Why are they right? Why are they wrong and us right?
Because they believe that's what people want. They're marketing something. They've got a product there, and it's a great product, don't get me wrong, but they believe that's what people want. If you actually go and do some of the research that we've done around rural communities, at no point has anybody asked for a flying, self-driving pod to pick them up from work. What they want is transportation that's affordable, clean, secure, and gets them where they want to go in a flexible manner.
I think you might have been asking them the wrong questions there, because I'm sure if you did offer them that opportunity, they'd love it.
No, I've asked people. We've asked people when we're doing this, around autonomous vehicles, do you want this? And no one's come back and said yes. And even the people, was it a roundtable academic debate down, and I stayed awake for most of it, in Vienna, and there are people doing research in and around this who say there's not one piece of research, and this is by two of the largest German automotive brands, there's no one piece of research at the moment out there that says people are ready or wanting autonomous vehicles. And that this particular brand doesn't perceive them being anywhere near ready until at least 2050. Right. And this is one of the brands that are pumping millions and millions and millions into this.
Yeah.
We'd say brand anonymous, but I can give you afterwards.
Yeah.
And you know what I drive. It's that.
Indeed.
So even when you've got the two largest automotive manufacturers in Europe saying this won't have to be on 2050,
right,
and there's no evidence to support it,
but they've got to be seen to be, as it were, helping the ecosystem by putting in R&D money, I assume.
The tech's there. I think you look at it slightly another way. I was driving another German brand the other day, and it has semi-autonomous driving.
Yeah.
Which is
so
awesome.
Assistive stuff rather than
There's no way I could crash into the truck in front because the car would brake for me, and I can't change lanes because it knows there's a car there.
Yeah,
that's where they see this as being a real value add to people, because it massively reduces accidents on the road, which will reduce insurance premiums, which will reduce the amount of traffic queues and all this sort of gubbins that cause us grief in the day. And eventually we might go to an autonomous area, but again, we need to change culture. We're not going to switch this on overnight and everyone's going to jump in pods. It just won't happen.
Totally right, absolutely. But people are talking about, God forbid, platooning, which is becoming a kind of a word that may or may not be picked up by the general public, but more people are talking about platooning. So, kind of a transitional phase between where we are at the moment, dumbish cars, to assistive, on the way to autonomous. Platooning is going to come in. What's platooning, Liam?
Well, I think platooning already happens on the M1. Or that's just could be people just driving too close to each other. But platooning is when you get vehicles to join up almost like a train. So they join in an autobahn or a motorway and they drive really close, and then the computer kicks in and they platoon. There's been some great platooning trials done in Sweden with a couple of the big truck companies up there, and successfully done actually with those, where you can get more trucks on the road driving closer and evidently safer. The challenge around platooning is because of the vehicles they're sitting lane one. You imagine a platoon of 10 trucks driving nose to tail. How are you supposed to get into lane one to exit a motorway? So there's a lot of challenges around our current infrastructure that says we're not ready for platooning or autonomous vehicles. It just won't work in terms of the way it is now. That's been seen as a way to reduce congestion and reduce carbon, but I would argue there are much better ways to reduce carbon than getting trucks to drive closer to each other.
Yeah, agreed. And it's a bit like, sort of smart motorways, which actually just means you use the hard shoulder and you've got nowhere to dive off to if you break down. Exactly. But these things simplistically all seem to make a lot of sense, and you could do all sorts of projections about carbon saved, etc. But in the actual practicality, people don't want autonomous vehicles. Do they really want a motorway without a hard shoulder? Do they really want to be, driving in their brand new autonomous vehicle, pressing a button for platooning as I drive up to Coventry? Not sure, really. Is it only going to be for HGV trucks? As you say, you then have we're not called HGV anymore, are they? Anyway, big trucks. Are you really going to have like an unbroken line for 10 miles of that, and you've got to plan your exit for a service station break or to peel off so much further in advance? None of it sounds very positive. And there's a bit of a backlash about smart motorways at the moment, isn't there? Because of the horror of what happens if you do break down outside of one of those little escape zones.
And there is a thing around this with all this. The key thing being the infrastructure is not fit for purpose. As we quite blunt about this. It's a wee bit like having a warehouse. And the approach to smart and sustainable transport is like having a warehouse that has a leaky roof. All we do is we put a bucket under the leak, and that fixes the leak for a short period of time. Then the bucket fills up. Then we have to buy another bucket, and that's exactly how we approach road building. We just make them wider, more of them, and we're not actually fixing the problem. And we've done research that's shown that through a cultural shift, and it doesn't have to be everyone doing this, 8% of people sharing vehicles or sharing infrastructure, let's call it that way. So you're not relying on your neighbour, but smarter ways of moving people around can reduce the traffic just in our little county here in Northamptonshire by 50%. And when we modelled that, it showed that rush hour traffic now does not exist. It means you get to work quicker, which means you get better. You don't fall into one of our colleagues' research areas of time poverty. You start to eradicate transport poverty. And we're not bashing people over the head either and saying, you've got to do this and you must stand at a bus stop.
Yeah.
But there are smarter ways to approach this using ICT and ITS technologies that give us greener solutions. And none of those solutions involve an autonomous vehicle.
Right.
And I strongly believe we use the capacity we have now to better effect, and then let's invest billions into smart technology, because smart technology in autonomous vehicles is not going to fix the problem. And one last point, we've had autonomy in the aviation sector for a long time, and they do it to really good effect. You can't fault what they do. They still require a human being to interact from the ground and the airplane to push the buttons on both sides. There is no way yet to have a fully automated aviation, which we talked about with drones last time. There's a whole difficulty around smart learning machines and the requirement still to have a human being to push buttons and interact with it. So we're never going to get to full autonomy.
You could do though. I believe most of the barriers around that are to do with consumer acceptance, aren't they? That almost nobody would actually get onto a plane that didn't have a pilot, preferably two. And you can see why. I mean, I would hardly describe those people as stupid. I mean, I think that would be very wise, not to totally rely on.
But we do go on things like the DLR in London, which is which is autonomous.
I'm not sure people know though. How many? I wonder if you ask people, do you know?
Tube trains are automatic as well. I watched one come into I think what station was that? I watched him come in reading a newspaper, which is a big no-no. You're not supposed to do that. Actually reading a newspaper, which I thought was quite cool.
That is really bad, though, isn't it? And that should not be happening.
These are autonomous on a closed circuit.
Yeah,
aircraft can be autonomous on a closed circuit.
Right.
Because of our airways, we're not talking. An aircraft doesn't just decide to dive off its air. Well, actually, some do to catastrophic event, but you don't decide when you're flying from Paris to New York to say, actually, you know what? I'm deciding mid-flight to go to Reykjavik, which we were talking about earlier.
Good point. Yeah. Yes,
it's different. It's a closed circuit automation. We have loads of automation in the supply chain.
Yeah.
Lots of biscuits are made and lots of things are made with automation, but it's closed circuit automation.
Very good point. Yeah, and all the variables are controlled, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's loads of scare stories about people walking in front of them, and can it detect whether it's a bike or a child or a cow or something, and it's you can't do that. Too many variables for the computer. Yeah,
agreed, absolutely. And it only took a small amount of snow last week. I think less than half a centimetre, and certainly the radar on my car stopped working. So yeah, I think a lot of the sensors on these platforms are very cool, but also pretty fragile in terms of what happens when the British or other weather interacts with them. All right, so I think we've addressed the questions. Are autonomous vehicles the future? No, we've kind of agreed. How will autonomous vehicles affect the supply chain? Well, we've said there isn't a solution to any of the problems in the supply chain.
Actually, is to some. There's really good autonomous vehicles inside ports.
Oh, okay. And inside Amazon warehouses and things, yeah. Yeah, okay.
And other warehouses are available. Just to say.
Good point.
And there's autonomy. There's great autonomy in the aviation industry with pushback tugs being made. So in a closed environment, autonomy can be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
And exploited to really good effect.
Yeah.
Which I suppose brings us on to the next piece.
Yeah.
Those elements of autonomy in a supply chain can have massive impacts on the environment.
In a good way.
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
And I think, again, in my personal opinion, will it help the... I mean, there's another argument with this. A lot of these autonomous vehicles, they're battery powered.
Yeah.
And we all know the stories about batteries and the crazy supply chains that they have that come with them.
And we're back to conflict minerals and such thing, aren't we?
Where do you end? So I think to remove that from it. There was a motor manufacturer who's reducing. They're letting people go, aren't they? This week, who was it? That was at Swindon. Is it Honda or
Honda's in Swindon.
Honda, the diesel. So the lack of diesel sales now, they're actually letting people off. So I mean, there's a whole thing around combustion engines as a whole. Is it more environmentally friendly than that? Yeah, arguably yes, it is. But if you're putting more vehicles on the road, then it's not.
Yes.
Which is what automation will do.
Yeah, and you've been berating the lack of infrastructure earlier, and the opening up the hard shoulder on the motorway is not exactly creating new infrastructure really, but the charging infrastructure, even for consumer vehicles, is just not there at the moment. You see lots of reviews in the weekend papers of people who tried to make longer but not crazy journeys from London to York or something, and they've tried to book their slots at charging stations at service stations on the way, and they've been out of order and so on and so forth. So yeah, that stuff is just not in place, and I personally can't see that changing super quick.
Actually, there's another point around this as well. As human beings, we seem to be putting ourselves into an environment where we want to spend more and more time on our own. So what we're potentially saying with autonomous vehicles is, instead of embracing innovative transport solutions such as a demand responsive bus that will go around when you need it, as you need it, and take you to the point where you need to go to. Okay, which a lot of vulnerable members of the community use at the moment, such as elderly and so forth, to combat social isolation. What we're saying is, in the future, they'll push a button and a pod will turn up and they'll sit in that pod on their own. There'll be no human interaction. It will drop them off at the daycare where they'll sit on their own because it'll be us, because we'll be old and we'll just be looking at our smartphone, and then we'll push a button and the pod will pick us up and bring us back.
That sounds great.
It might be. I think it's brilliant too, and I won't have to talk to anyone.
Exactly.
It's a bit like the London Tube analogy. You've got hundreds of people on a tube, and nobody smiles at each other. No one interacts with each other. Yet we wonder. This is massively going off topic. We wonder why instances of mental health in this country are increasing at massively exponential rates. Yet we seem hell bent on pushing ourselves into infrastructures where people won't talk to each other.
So we're forced not to talk as opposed to having a choice.
Which is absolutely verified by lots of medical professionals that are far smarter than me. It's a verified way of developing mental health, is this social isolation.
Yeah, true.
So this is all this is going to do. It's going to drive people into, not only is it going to increase congestion because more things will be on the road, so it's in helping the environment. Well, it's not just really the physical environment, it's also the environment you don't see, like the mental health piece.
Yeah,
and it's a big piece around that. It comes back to the culture. If you've got a pod that will turn up and take 2 or 3 people, brilliant.
Yeah,
you start to share stuff, but we're not there culturally. And maybe instead of spending billions on developing a battery to last longer, we should take a little bit of that and at the same time do some social research around how we change people's behaviours.
Very good point. Excellent. And on that note, I think we've run out of time.
So I just want to say funding can be sent to liam.fassam@northampton.ac.uk.
All contributions greatly received, and he will give me the crumbs from his table, which is what always happens to us poor anthropologists. A great conversation, Liam. I
As
thought
always,
anyway. Let's hope our listeners agree with us, and we look forward to your feedback.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter @Uni4Logistics and @Societal_. We'll be back next week with a new episode. But until then, goodbye.